The chamber was alive with silence, the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against every ear as if it were a sound in itself. Thousands of eyes, not all human, fixed upon the lone figure, suspended in the center. Her body hung rigid, hands bound tightly behind her back, a rope tethering her to the radiant structure above. She was young, too young to look so broken already, but defiance still clung to her expression in fleeting traces, like embers refusing to go out. Her name was Alara, whispered quietly among the humans who had been forced to watch, though never uttered by the aliens who judged her. To them, she was not a person but a test, a symbol of whether humanity deserved a place in the wider order of existence. The aliens filled the circular tiers of the tribunal hall in seamless rows, their pale bodies glimmering under the blue-white beams of light cascading from the dome. They moved little, spoke less, yet their presence was suffocating. Each was seated with a rigid stillness that gave the impression of statues carved from light and shadow. Only their eyes, many in shapes no human anatomy could ever match, betrayed interest, shining with curiosity, with hunger. At the front of the assembly sat the council, a cluster of elder beings whose forms bent reality just by existing, their outlines shifting like smoke that had been given bones. When one spoke, it was not with a voice but with resonance that shook the floor and crawled up into Alara's chest. She will endure, the resonance declared, reverberating in tones that defied language. Or she will dissolve. This is the measure. The hall responded with a collective murmur, a wave of agreement rolling across alien throats and minds alike. Humans were new to them, fragile creatures of flesh and thought, and yet they had defied capture longer than expected. Alara was one of those who had resisted the longest, and for that reason, she had been chosen. A lesson had to be carved into her body, a spectacle of obedience for all to see. The restraints tightened as if in response to unspoken commands. Alara drew a shallow breath, her lungs screaming at her to resist panic. She refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear unmasked. Pain was already her companion. Her wrists were raw, her legs trembling from hours of exposure, but it was only the beginning. With a motion too swift to follow, beams of light descended from the ceiling, striking her body like needles made of fire. She arched involuntarily, a strangled cry breaking loose before she could bite it back. The aliens leaned forward, every flicker of agony observed, measured, recorded. To them, her suffering was data. To her, it was the edge of her humanity being tested. Her thoughts drifted, against her will, to the memory of home. Earth was far away, perhaps unreachable now. She remembered her younger brother's laughter, a sound that had always shielded her from despair. She clung to it now, forcing it between the walls of her mind as if it could absorb some of the torment flowing into her nerves. Every time the beams shifted frequency, the pain reshaped itself, sometimes a burning, sometimes an icy, hollow gnawing through her bones. The council was thorough, ensuring no sensation was left untested. Alara refused to scream again, though her throat burned with the need. The audience was not uniformly unmoved. Some of the alien spectators tilted their heads in what resembled intrigue, others in fascination that bordered on admiration. A few whispered to one another in vibrations so subtle that they stirred the air without sound. It was unusual for a subject to endure so long without collapse. Perhaps there was something in humans the council had underestimated. But the tribunal was not designed to admit doubt. It was designed to break. One of the council beings extended a hand, and with it came a wave of pressure. Alara felt her heartbeat falter, her vision swimming as invisible fingers squeezed at her chest. She gasped for air, her body convulsing as if the breath of life itself was being wrung from her. Still she clung to defiance, to the idea that her suffering meant something more than submission. She thought of all those watching, the other captives forced to sit among the audience, their faces pale and hollow, some looking away while others stared in desperate solidarity. If she gave in now, if she shattered completely, perhaps their hope would shatter too. But flesh is only flesh, and spirit only spirit, when pushed to breaking. The pain became unbearable, a flood that swept away her thoughts, drowning memory and resistance alike. She screamed until the sound broke into silence, her body jerking like a marionette pulled by too many strings at once. The beams of light withdrew suddenly, leaving her limp, hanging by the rope. For a moment the hall was utterly still, as though the universe itself had paused to listen for her next breath. None came. Her head lolled forward, hair obscuring her face. The tribunal's resonance stirred again, solemn and final. The measure is complete. The audience responded with a chorus of low tones, an alien approval that sounded more like mourning than triumph. Alara's body swung gently, lifeless, the final proof of human fragility. The council regarded her without expression, without pity, as though death were nothing but another piece of information added to their ledger. For the humans who watched, despair settled like chains on their hearts. The girl who had stood for them was gone. Their last defiant ember had been extinguished. Yet the silence lingered strangely, longer than usual, as though the hall itself was waiting. The aliens shifted in their seats, some exchanging glances that betrayed unease. Nothing moved but the slow arc of the rope. And though no one could yet know it, though no whisper dared suggest it, the story was not finished. Alara's death was only the beginning. The tribunal chamber remained cloaked in stillness, the silence so absolute it seemed to press against the walls. The girl's body hung motionless, swaying ever so slightly in the dim light, her lifeless form already being absorbed into memory as a demonstration of alien supremacy. The audience began to shift uneasily, the spectacle complete, their attention ready to drift toward the next judgment, the next trial. Yet something in the air was unsettled, a current beneath the quiet, a hum not yet recognized. 37 minutes stretched like an eternity, time marked by the hollow rhythm of expectation, until the first sign arrived, a tremor no louder than a sigh. Her fingers twitched. A ripple passed through those nearest, though none dared speak. At first, it might have been dismissed as the reflex of a dead body, some final spasm of muscle releasing its last reserve. But the twitch became a curl, and the curl became a deliberate clench, the rope above creaking as her hand strained against nothingness. A murmur spread across the seats, not in sound but in collective thought, as minds both alien and human alike turned sharply toward the impossible. Alara's head lifted, slowly, as though dragging the weight of two worlds with it, and a faint breath rattled from her chest. She was not supposed to breathe again. The glow came next. It began at the edges of her skin, a faint shimmer like starlight reflected on water. Her veins lit as if they had been filled with liquid fire, pulsing in rhythm with a heartbeat that had no right to exist. The rope snapped suddenly, brittle against the force of her rising body, and she dropped soundlessly to the platform below. Gasps echoed across the chamber, alien and human alike, a dissonant chorus of disbelief. Alara stood hunched, hair covering her face, her frame trembling as though she bore more weight than she should have survived. And then she lifted her head. Her eyes glowed with a radiance that was not natural, not earthly, not wholly human. They burned with an awareness that had no place in a mortal body, and when she looked around the chamber, every being felt as though her gaze rested directly upon them, stripping away the safety of distance. The council stirred, their outlines flickering with agitation. For the first time in generations, their certainty had fractured. The girl who should have died now stood before them transformed, and the question of what she had become hung heavy in the air. Alara's voice cut through the silence, soft yet carrying as though the chamber itself wanted her words to be heard. "I have seen beyond." The declaration sent ripples through the assembly, some leaning forward, others recoiling. She paused, as though tasting the strangeness of speech, and continued. "You sought to measure me with suffering, to strip me of what I was. But in death, I crossed a threshold you cannot follow. I returned not as your subject, but as something else." The words carried no arrogance, no desperation. They were a statement of fact, delivered with a calmness that unsettled the alien council more than any defiance could. The central figure of the tribunal rose, its form shifting violently as though struggling to contain itself. "This is anomaly," the resonance thundered. "No mortal rises after dissolution. You are not permitted." Its voice shook the platform, yet Alara did not flinch. Her eyes never left the council, her new presence radiating power that pressed outward in invisible waves. The audience, thousands strong, leaned into the tension, caught between fear and awe, between the known order and the unknown possibilities standing alive before them. Within the human captives, hope flared like a sudden flame. Their despair was pierced by the sight of her standing tall, no longer a victim but a survivor of the impossible. Whispers spread among them, restrained though desperate, as though speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile miracle. To the aliens beside them, however, hope looked like danger. Murmurs of control and restraint began to stir in the tribunal seats, voices urging the council to act before the anomaly spread. Alara's presence had become more than defiance. It was contagion, and its infection was belief. She turned her gaze briefly to the human crowd, her expression softening as though she carried them with her. But the moment passed quickly, replaced with the gravity that anchored her to the conflict at hand. "You thought my death was the end," she said, her voice resonant now, strengthened by something beyond her. "But what lies beyond is not nothingness. It is fire, it is vision, it is return. And I did not come back alone." At those words, an audible shiver passed through the chamber, as if unseen forces had been named and drawn closer by her recognition. The council conferred in fragmented resonance, their shapes colliding and shifting like storm clouds tearing at one another. Some urged containment, others destruction, still others observation. The hall quivered with indecision, the very air charged with the weight of her presence. For the first time, the invincible order of the tribunal faltered. They had forged a spectacle meant to crush the spirit of an entire people, and instead had created a living contradiction, a girl who had crossed into death and returned altered, luminous, dangerous. Alara's breathing steadied. The glow from her veins dimmed slightly, focusing into her eyes, as though she were learning to contain the force within her. She did not rush forward, nor did she lash out. She simply stood, unbroken, waiting. The power of patience in her silence was more terrifying than violence could have been. The audience, once restless, now held their breath. Something vast loomed on the edge of unfolding, a truth not yet spoken but inevitable. The council at last spoke again, their resonance fractured, less certain than before. "This form cannot remain," they declared. "It must be resolved." But even as they said it, their tones wavered. They had no precedent for her, no measure, no category. She was the contradiction to their system, the fracture in their perfect judgment. And Alara, standing beneath their gaze, knew it. Her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, not of triumph, but of recognition. She had seen beyond, and she understood now that survival was no longer her struggle alone. The balance of two worlds rested in what came next. The silence that followed was not the silence of completion, but of a storm gathering. The chamber shook as if the very foundations of the tribunal were straining under the weight of what had returned. Alara stood at the center, her body still trembling from the residue of resurrection, yet her eyes burned with clarity. The council no longer looked untouchable. Their shifting outlines quivered, their resonance faltered, and for the first time, they seemed less like deities and more like creatures afraid of what they could not explain. The audience, thousands of alien forms in concentric tiers, leaned in with a hunger that bordered on terror, every being sensing that what unfolded here would be remembered long after their lifetimes had passed. A figure broke from the stillness, one of the enforcers stationed closest to the platform. Its body was armored in bands of translucent metal that pulsed with internal light, each movement accompanied by a hiss of energy. Without waiting for a command, it surged forward, an executioner eager to restore order. A weapon shaped like a spear but alive with vibrating currents extended from its arm. The crowd tensed as the blade cut through the air, descending toward Alara's chest. She did not move until the last instant, when the glow in her veins surged again, and with a single raised hand, she caught the weapon mid-strike. The vibration of the blade screamed, sparks scattering, but her grip did not falter. The enforcer's form convulsed as if struck by its own power, collapsing into silence. Alara released the spear, which dissolved into particles before it struck the floor. Gasps cascaded through the chamber, waves of astonishment and unease. The council's resonance wavered in overlapping tones, commands layered with uncertainty. Contain her. Restrain. Eliminate. But those words rang hollow, less like decrees and more like desperate attempts to reassert authority. Alara straightened, her breath steadying, her voice calm when it emerged again. You believed pain would define me. You believed death would erase me. Yet here I stand. What I carry now is not yours to name, and it is not yours to destroy. The humans in the crowd, who had sat shackled in their despair, now lifted their heads. Their eyes shone with something almost forgotten, hope. Some pressed forward against the limits of their bonds, straining as though her strength might reach them too. Among the aliens, divisions deepened. Some recoiled, unsettled by what she had become, while others leaned forward with reverence, as if they were witnessing the birth of a truth greater than their council. Whispers passed like sparks, multiplying faster than the tribunal could suppress. The spectacle meant to demonstrate control had slipped into chaos, and Alara was its axis. The council's central figure surged forward, its form unraveling into jagged limbs of light. From its chest erupted a beam so pure it seemed to erase the air in its path, a strike that had ended countless lives without resistance. Alara closed her eyes. When the beam struck, it shattered against an unseen barrier, dispersing into harmless fragments that fell like glittering dust. She exhaled, her voice emerging with a resonance that did not belong to her alone. I do not fight you with flesh. I am bound to something larger. You sought to measure life and discovered instead what lies beyond it. A hush consumed the chamber. Even the council hesitated, its limbs recoiling, its light flickering unsteadily. The girl they had sought to break now stood as a mirror, reflecting their own fear back upon them. For all their power, they were not invincible. They were not infinite. They had seen death as a tool, but in her return, death had become a messenger, one they could not silence. Alara turned her gaze to the humans in the seats, and her words shifted, gentle yet commanding. You are not powerless. You are not forgotten. They wanted you to believe your lives meant nothing beyond this chamber, but I have seen differently. What they fear most is not our end. It is our beginning. Chains rattled as men and women strained toward her, their despair burning away, replaced with something raw and unstoppable. Even bound, they felt the tide turning. The council, fractured and desperate, gathered their resonance into one final command. Destroy her. Now. The remaining enforcers moved, a swarm of bodies converging, weapons igniting the air with arcs of energy. Alara did not retreat. Her glow intensified, not violent but radiant, her form a silhouette against the blinding light. When the enforcers struck, their weapons dissolved on contact, the energy redirected back into their own forms, collapsing them into silence. The chamber rang with shock, the crowd unable to deny what they had seen. Alara had not fought like a warrior, she had endured like a force of nature. Breathing heavily, she lowered her hands, the glow ebbing slightly as though her strength had limits even now. The silence that followed was not empty, but alive with possibility, the entire tribunal suspended on the edge of transformation. She looked once more to the council, her voice steady, but edged with finality. You tried to measure me, but I am not your measure. You tried to end me, but I am not your ending. What I am now belongs to no cage, no trial, no judgment. Her words echoed not just in sound but in the minds of every being present, seating themselves deeper than command or law could reach. The council wavered, their once unshakable outlines trembling like shadows in a storm. They could not move forward, nor could they retreat, caught in the truth of their failure. Around them, the crowd shifted, a tide turning not with violence, but with realization. The spectacle had ended, but not in the way they intended. They had not broken humanity. They had birthed its symbol. Alara's body sagged slightly, exhaustion creeping in, but she stood firm. The storm was not over, but she had survived its center. She had revealed the fracture in their dominion, and through her, others would see it too. As she cast one last glance at the thousands who watched, she whispered words not meant for the council, but for every captive soul. This is only the beginning. And with those words, the silence deepened again, not with despair but with anticipation, as though the universe itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next.